Okay, let's dive in. For centuries, political ideology, those big systems of ideas like liberalism, socialism, conservatism, they haven't just been abstract concepts floating around.
No, not at all. They've been really powerful forces.
Yeah, shaping wars, sparking revolutions, building nations, defining how billions of people see the world and their place in it. They are, as our source puts it, kind of the worldwide language of political discourse.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the huge changes brought about by ideas coming out of the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution or, the push for national liberation. Ideologies gave people the frameworks to understand all that upheaval.
And to argue for completely different ways forward, right?
Exactly. Dramatically different paths.
But here's the question that just seems to keep coming back again and again. What if that whole era is, well, over? What if we're actually living through time where those old ideological battles are finished? Or maybe just fading out?
It's a persistent idea, definitely.
Yeah.
Predictions of ideology's demise, they've been around for a long time.
They really have, popping up pretty regularly throughout the modern age. And that idea that we might be in a post-ideological age, that's exactly what we want to unpack today.
Mm-hmm. That's the core focus.
So this deep dive is all about exploring that concept, the idea of a post-ideological world. And our guide, our main source for this, is Andrew Haywood. We're drawing specifically from his work looking at these claims, these sort of obituaries for ideology.
Right. And our mission really is to take you through the most prominent versions of these predictions. We want to look at the arguments behind them and then, crucially, explore why Haywood suggests that, despite all these declarations of its death, political ideology seems remarkably resilient.
It just won't go away.
It won't. So we'll look at the different shapes these end-of-ideology claims have taken and try to understand the counter-arguments, the reasons why it seems to stick around.
Yeah, we're going to try and help you navigate these ideas, see the nuances, and understand why this whole debate isn't just some dusty academic thing. It's actually still really relevant for understanding the politics we see all around us right now.
Definitely. So let's get started.
Okay, where do we begin? Setting the stage.
Yeah, I think to really get this, you need to appreciate just how huge ideology's influence has been. As our reading highlights, it's been absolutely central to world history for, well over 200 years now?
2 centuries, yeah.
Its emergence is deeply tied to those massive shifts, economic, social, political upheavals. Things like the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the stuff that basically created the modern world as we know it.
Right, these weren't just local blips on the radar. They had global consequences, completely changing societies,
Right.
power structures, everything.
Totally. And ideologies gave people the tools, the lenses, the maps, really, to make sense of all these dizzying changes. And, importantly, to mobilize for action. They offered blueprints for building new societies, or sometimes for defending the old ones.
And it started mostly in the West, right? But didn't stay there.
Exactly. Well, political ideology, as we understand it, largely kicked off in the industrializing West. It spread like wildfire. It popped up in all sorts of different cultural and political settings across the globe. It truly became, as the source says, a kind of universal language for talking about politics.
A way for people anywhere to say, here's what's wrong, here's what we demand, here's our vision for how things should be.
Precisely, no matter where they were.
Now, obviously, the role ideology has played as well. It's intensely debated, isn't it? Has it been a force for good? Has it led to, progress, enlightenment, truth, justice?
Or, on the flip side, has it been mostly negative? Has it generated distorted, blinkered worldviews, fostered intolerance, and ultimately led to oppression and conflict?
History gives you plenty of examples for both sides, unfortunately.
It really does. And it's interesting, as the source points out, that when the conversation turns to whether ideology is still relevant today, it often leans heavily on those criticisms.
Right, the idea that ideology is maybe inherently problematic, even dangerous, and so, hey, maybe it's a good thing if it's finally disappearing.
And that thought process leads us straight into predicting its demise.
Which the source calls endism.
Endism, yeah,
Sounds a bit dramatic, but it works, doesn't it?
it really does.
Hmm.
Endism is the term Haywood uses for all these varied, numerous predictions that have been made about the imminent death of political ideology. It's actually quite striking when you look back at how many times people have basically written ideology's obituary.
Each time thinking, okay, this is it. It's finally fading away.
Exactly.
Okay, so endism is the umbrella term. What are the specific types, the different flavors of endism that Haywood identifies and kind of unpacks for us?
Well, he outlined several key versions that have become prominent at different times. There's the original, maybe the most famous one, the idea of the end of ideology itself.
Right.
Then, a bit later, and maybe grander, you get the end of history thesis. We'll also look at the idea that politics has somehow moved beyond left and right. And finally, there's this notion that maybe the triumph of reason or science could somehow replace ideology altogether.
Wow, okay. A whole collection of ways people have declared ideology basically obsolete. But the source gives us a really important counter-argument right from the start, doesn't it? Something that frames this whole discussion.
Yes, absolutely. And it's the central puzzle, really. Despite all these persistent, varied predictions, Haywood argues that ideological politics remains, and this is his phrase, stubbornly resistant to being disinvented.
It just refuses to go away.
It hangs on. It just won't leave the political stage.
And exploring why that is, despite all these claims that it's finished, that's really the core of this deep dive, isn't it?
That's exactly it.
Okay, great. So let's jump into the first big one, the end of ideology thesis proper.
Right. This idea really took off, became quite factual in the 1950s and early 1960s. And the figure everyone points to, the most influential voice back then, was the American sociologist Daniel Bell.
Daniel Bell, and he wrote a book, right?
Yeah, published in 1960, very aptly titled The End of Ideology. It was kind of landmark statement of this whole position.
So what was going on in the world, particularly in the West, where Bell was focused, that made him think ideology was ending in the 50s and 60s?
Well, Bell was really struck by what he saw as a fundamental shift in the political mood in the industrialized West after World War II. He noticed this broad, seemingly new consensus emerging among the major political parties.
You mean like mainstream liberals, conservatives, socialists in places like the US and the UK?
Exactly, those kinds of parties. He felt the really intense, sometimes existential, ideological battles that had ripped societies apart in the first half of the century. Especially the challenges from fascism and communism. They seem to have lost their power, their appeal, at least within the Western political mainstream.
Well, fascism had been beaten militarily, obviously.
Right. And while communism was still a huge force elsewhere in the world, its revolutionary pull within the West seemed, well, contained or diminished in that period.
Okay, so if the big ideological alternatives were defeated or sidelined, what did Bell think politics was actually about then?
This is the core of his thesis. He argued that politics wasn't fundamentally about those huge, grand, normative questions anymore. Debates about the nature of the good society or how to radically restructure everything.
So less about capitalism versus socialism in that revolutionary sense.
Much less, in his view.
Yeah.
Instead, politics had essentially been boiled down to technical questions. Practical matters of how. How do we manage an advanced industrial economy? How do we deliver affluence? How do we ensure ongoing economic growth and material prosperity for people?
It sounds like he was saying economics had kind of swallowed politics. The big fights weren't about values or visions, but just efficient management.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. Economics, or maybe economic management and growth, became the central game. And in that context, traditional ideologies with their sweeping critiques and radical plans for the future just seemed increasingly irrelevant.
If the goal is just making the current system run better and deliver more stuff, you don't need ideologues. You need managers, technocrats.
Exactly. You need experts, technicians,
Yeah.
not people arguing about utopia.
But, and here's the big but, right? According to Haywood's analysis in our source, this wasn't actually the end of ideology, was it? This is where the critique comes in.
Precisely. This is the crucial counter-argument. Haywood argues that Bell wasn't seeing the absence of ideology. What he was actually witnessing was the temporary emergence and dominance of a very broad ideological consensus among the main players.
So they weren't ideologically neutral. They just sort of agreed on a shared ideology.
Yes, they had converged on a common ideological framework.
And what was that framework? What was this consensus built around?
It centered on what's been called various things: managed capitalism, welfare capitalism, or sometimes social democracy. It was basically a mix.
A mix of what?
Well, it combined core elements of a market economy.
Yeah.
Private property, competition, the idea of material incentives driving things, but with a pretty strong role for the state.
How so?
The state was involved in managing the economy, providing social welfare safety nets, things like healthcare, education, unemployment support, and generally aiming for full employment and economic stability. It was a kind of blend, an accommodation between ideas historically linked to liberalism, conservatism, and socialism.
And the source really stresses that this consensus itself was ideological. It wasn't just neutral common sense or pragmatism.
Absolutely, that's a key insight. This post-war settlement wasn't value-free at all. It reflected a powerful shared belief in certain principles. Faith in market economics to create wealth, the importance of private property, the idea that material incentives work. But also tempered by a belief in social solidarity and the state having a responsibility to kind of soften capitalism's sharp edges and make sure there was a basic level of well-being for everyone.
So you could argue it was the temporary victory of one specific ideological package, this moderate state-managed capitalism over the more radical alternatives, at least in the West at that specific time.
That's exactly the argument. Ideology didn't vanish. One particular version just became so dominant that the others seemed less relevant for a while. It created the illusion of a post-ideological age.
Right, a really crucial distinction as you hinted, this triumph didn't last forever, did it? Haywood shows how this consensus started to wobble not too long after Bell's book came out.
Yeah, it proved pretty temporary. Several things challenged it.
Like what?
Well, first, the 1960s saw the rise of the New Left. This wasn't just politics, it was an ideological revival. It brought back interest in more radical thinking, including Marxist ideas, even anarchist ideas, that had been pushed to the margins by the post-war consensus.
And that decade also saw totally new kinds of ideological concerns bubbling up, didn't it? Things that didn't fit the old molds.
Absolutely. You start seeing the emergence and growing prominence of modern ideologies that didn't map neatly onto that old left-right spectrum. Think about feminism, really bringing gender into the political conversation in a new way.
Yeah?
And ecologism, which started fundamentally questioning the whole economic and social order from an environmental standpoint. These opened up completely new lines of political argument.
And the economic good times didn't last either, did they?
No, the economic stability that kind of underpinned that whole post-war consensus started to fray. You get the onset of serious economic recession and stagflation in the 1970s.
Stagflation, that horrible mix of high inflation and high unemployment.
Exactly. Painful stuff. And that crisis exposed weaknesses in the managed capitalism model.
Yeah.
It created an opening, fertile ground for a renewed interest in free market ideas that had been less popular for a while.
Ah, which paved the way for the new right.
Precisely. Thinkers and politicians started arguing strongly again for deregulation, privatization, cutting taxes, shrinking the state's role, directly challenging the assumptions and policies of that post-war welfare state agreement.
People like Thatcher and Reagan come to mind.
Two examples, exactly. They represented this powerful new right challenge to the established ideological consensus.
So within just a couple of decades of Bell declaring the end of ideology, the ideological scene in the West had actually become much more divided and contested again.
That's right. And Haywood points out another really big limitation of Bell's thesis. It was very narrow geographically.
He was basically just looking at his own backyard, so to speak.
Pretty much. Bell's analysis was focused almost entirely on the industrialized West North America, Western Europe. He was describing what he saw there.
Which, as you said earlier, leaves out most of the world.
A massive chunk. Haywood makes the point that while the West might have had this period of relative ideological calm, or rather consensus dominance in the 50s and 60s, the rest of the world was often buzzing with ideological conflict.
Right. Communism wasn't defeated globally.
Far from it. It was firmly in power in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, and spreading its influence elsewhere.
And it wasn't just state communism either, was it?
No, you had incredibly active revolutionary political movements all across Asia, Africa, Latin America. These were often driven by powerful mixes of ideologies. Anti-colonialism, socialism, nationalism, fighting for independence, fighting for fundamentally different ways of organizing society. So if you look globally, the 1950s and 60s were anything but post-ideological.
Okay, so wrapping up Bell then, the end of ideology thesis, according to Haywood's critique, was really describing a temporary, geographically specific ideological consensus, not a fundamental end to ideology itself. It missed the revival of old ideologies, the birth of new ones, the impact of economic change, and all the intense ideological struggles happening outside the West.
That's the core critique in a nutshell. It was like mistaking a lull in one particular battle for the end of the entire war of ideas.
Which brings us neatly to the next big prediction, one with an even grander title, the end of history thesis. This came later, right? Tied to the end of the Cold War.
Indeed. This one's famously linked to Francis Fukuyama, particularly his 1989 essay, The End of History, and then the book he expanded it into in 1992, The End of History and the Last Man.
And unlike Bell, who thought ideas were becoming less important, Fukuyama seemed to be saying the opposite, that ideas had won, but specifically one set of ideas had achieved total victory.
That's the crucial difference, yeah.
Ah,
Fukuyama wasn't saying ideas don't matter. He was arguing that the big fundamental history of ideological conflict had reached its conclusion. Why? Because one particular set of ideas had triumphed over all credible rivals.
and the victory he was pointing to was the collapse of communism around 1989-91.
Yeah, it was the key trigger, yes. He saw the defeat of fascism back in 45, and then, crucially, the sudden dramatic collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe from 1989 onwards, leading to the breakup of the Soviet Union itself in 91. He read these massive events, especially the end of the Cold War, as the final passing of Marxism-Leninism as a viable, world-changing ideology. With the major alternatives gone, he argued, the fundamental ideological debate about how to organize society was effectively over.
So the debate ended because liberal democracy was the last ideology standing, basically.
That was the core of his argument. When he talked about the end of history, he didn't mean, that events would stop happening or time would end. He meant the end of the history of ideas, the end of that grand struggle over the fundamental principles for organizing human societies. He saw this emerging, almost worldwide agreement on the desirability of liberal democracy as the final form of human government.
And how did he define this victorious liberal democracy? What did it look like?
Well, as our source notes, he defined it pretty broadly. It was a system that combined a market or capitalist economy with an open, competitive political system, based on elections, rule of law, basic rights. He saw this model becoming accepted across the globe as the most rational, most effective way to run things.
Now, Haywood acknowledges that the events Fukuyama was looking at, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the USSR, were obviously huge world-changing events.
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't downplay their significance. The collapse of Soviet communism, the market reforms in China, they undeniably shifted the global balance of ideological power. The world did look profoundly different after 1991.
But the source questions whether this really meant the end of history, right? Whether ideological debate truly stopped.
Exactly. The critique is that while the global ideological map changed dramatically, it's really questionable whether fundamental ideological argument actually ceased. In fact, Haywood points out that new, or maybe revitalized ideological forces quickly rose to prominence after Fukuyama declared history over.
Like what? What filled the gap, if not liberal democracy everywhere?
Well, most significantly, perhaps, was the major revival and global spread of political Islam. This emerged as a really potent ideological force that didn't fit neatly into that liberal democratic box. It offered a fundamentally different vision for society and government, and its influence spread far beyond traditionally Muslim-majority countries.
Right. And the source also suggests that even where communism collapsed, it didn't automatically lead only to liberal democracy taking root, did it?
That's another key point. Haywood raises the possibility that in some places, the vacuum left by the collapse of state communism didn't just get filled by liberalism. It allowed for the resurgence of other, sometimes much older, forms of collective identity and loyalty.
Like nationalism or
Yeah.
ethnic identities.
Yeah, things like nationalism, racialism, various forms of religious fundamentalism. These forces often pose significant challenges to liberal democratic aspirations. Sometimes they led to new kinds of authoritarianism or conflicts based more on identity politics than on the old left-right ideological clashes.
So the world didn't just flatten out into a liberal democratic landscape. It maybe got more complex, ideologically speaking, just in different ways.
Precisely. And beyond that, the source digs into a deeper critique of Fukuyama's underlying assumptions. He kind of inherited this optimistic view, rooted in classical liberalism, that industrial capitalism, especially when paired with liberal democracy, naturally delivers social mobility and material security for pretty much everyone in society.
The ideal being that if a system delivers the goods and basic freedoms, people will just naturally agree it's the best way, the good society.
Yeah, it's this optimistic premise that suggests you can reach fundamental agreement on the good society if the system satisfies the main interests and desires of most people.
But does capitalism actually work like that in reality? Does it treat everyone equally?
Well, Haywood pushes back hard on that. He notes that while capitalism is undeniably dynamic, incredibly efficient at generating wealth, historically it just hasn't treated all social classes or individuals the same.
It creates inequalities.
Often significant ones, yes. It tends to produce winners and losers, and it generates vastly different life experiences and opportunities for different groups even within the same society.
Okay, so if capitalism doesn't universally satisfy everyone's interests or aspirations, then the basis for a universal agreement on the good society under that system starts to look pretty shaky.
Exactly. If there are fundamental conflicts of interest, fundamental disparities built into the economic system itself, then ideological debates about how to fix those problems, or maybe whether a different system is needed altogether, are almost certain to continue.
Makes sense?
So, the source concludes, ideological conflict and debate were highly unlikely to have just ended in the late 20th century with some final worldwide victory for liberalism.
It feels like we've heard this before. Like, remember the predictions about the inevitable victory of socialism back at the end of the 19th century? They turned out wrong. Maybe the prediction of liberalism's final victory at the end of the 20th was just premature, too.
The parallels are definitely striking. And just to hammer home how contested the whole idea of history even is, the source gives us this really insightful sidebar on how different major ideologies actually view history itself, which makes the notion of a single end of history look problematic from the get-go.
Oh, right. I remember seeing that. How do different ideologies see history playing out?
Well, liberals, generally speaking, tend to see history as a story of progress, right? Driven by reason, accumulating knowledge, leading towards greater freedom, usually through gradual reform. History is moving forward, getting better.
Okay. And conservatives, often different.
Often quite different, yeah. Conservatives tend to emphasize tradition, continuity, the wisdom of the past. They might be skeptical about rapid change, sometimes viewing history as maybe a decline from a better past, but perhaps open to cycles, a return to enduring values, not necessarily linear progress.
And socialists, especially Marxists, they have a very definite view.
Oh, yeah. Very strong linear progressive view. Marxists see history driven by class struggle, moving through predictable stages, feudalism, capitalism towards a final destination, a classless communist society. That's the ultimate endpoint.
What about fascists? Their view is pretty dark, usually.
Typically, yeah. Fascist ideology often sees history as degeneration, a falling away from some idealized national or racial past. Their view is often cyclical too, believing a national rebirth is possible, but it usually requires violence, a rupture, asserting collective will, not gradual progress.
And finally, religious fundamentalists.
They often see the present as a time of moral or spiritual decline, compared to an idealized past based on religious law. But interestingly, their vision for fixing it, for regeneration, can be quite radical, quite modernist in a way, a complete overturning of the current corrupt order to restore a divinely ordained one. So they aren't always just traditional conservatives wanting slow change.
Wow. So if the basic understanding of history itself, what drives it, where it's going, if it's even going anywhere specific, is so vastly different depending on your ideological starting point, then the idea of a single, universally agreed end of history seems, well, impossible. It just reflects one particular view.
Precisely. The very concept is loaded, ideologically contested from the start, which really reinforces the critique that Fukuyama's thesis, while capturing a huge global moment, didn't actually signal the end of ideological debate, partly because the meaning of history itself is still up for grabs.
Okay, that gives a much clearer picture of the arguments against Fukuyama. Now let's shift gears to the third type of endism, this idea of being beyond left and right. This feels like it connects more to those broader social cultural changes we touched on, maybe linked to postmodernity.
It's very much rooted in that context, yes. This angle suggests that the traditional political ideologies that grew up alongside modern industrial society, liberalism, socialism, conservatism, are becoming irrelevant because the very foundations of that society, the structures and ways of thinking they addressed, are themselves crumbling or changing profoundly. It directly links the supposed end of ideology to this idea of a shift into a postmodern condition.
So the world has changed so much socially, culturally, maybe technologically, that the old political map, especially that simple left-right line, just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't capture what's really going on.
That's the core idea. The notion of postmodernity suggests that while the big ideologies have tried to adapt, you hear terms like post-liberalism, post-Marxism, post-feminism, something more fundamental has shifted in how we even understand the world.
And what is that fundamental shift?
It's seen as a move away from what's called modernism.
Mm-hmm.
Modernism, which really grew out of the Enlightenment, is built on foundationalism.
Foundationalism.
Yeah, the belief that you can establish objective truths, universal values, grand theories that explain society and history. It's the kind of thinking that underpins traditional ideologies, like liberalism or Marxism, right? Each offered a rival path to the good life, based on what they saw as fundamental, objective realities about humans or society or economics.
Okay, I get that. And postmodernism rejects this.
Fundamentally rejects it. A core theme of postmodernism, famously summed up by Jean-Francois Lyotard, is an incredulity towards meta-narratives.
Incredulity towards meta-narratives. Okay, that sounds pretty academic too. Break it down for us.
Meta-narratives are basically those big overarching stories or theories that claim to explain everything. Universal theories of history, grand explanations for why things are the way they are, blueprints for utopia.
Like Marxism explaining all of history as class struggle leading to communism. Or maybe some liberal ideas about inevitable progress towards freedom.
Exactly like that. Those are classic meta-narratives. Postmodernism is deeply skeptical of these kinds of totalizing explanations. It tends to see the world as much more fragmented, diverse, constantly changing, contingent, lacking any single overarching truth or direction. There's no solid foundation we can all agree on to build political ideas anymore.
Okay, so if we're skeptical of those grand stories that used to structure how we understood society and history, how does that connect to the idea that the left-right divide is fading?
Well, Haywood argues this shift towards postmodern anti-foundationalism helps explain why that old left-right spectrum seems less relevant, less able to capture the political landscape. Because that left-right divide was the primary way ideological conflict was organized for a very long time through the 19th and 20th centuries.
Why was it so dominant back then?
Because, largely, the major ideologies of that era, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, communism, were all wrestling with the same central problem, the nature and destiny of industrial society. The core debate really revolved around the right balance between two key forces, the market and the state.
Right. Free market capitalism versus state control.
Pretty much. Should society be organized mainly through free markets, emphasizing individual liberty, private enterprise? Or should it lean more towards state intervention, collective ownership, maybe central planning, prioritizing equality and social welfare? The left generally pushed for more state inequality, the right for more market and individual freedom.
So it was basically a spectrum defined by economics and the role of the state.
To a huge extent, yes. But Haywood notes something important. Politics hasn't necessarily become less ideological since, say, the 1960s. It's more that ideological developments have become much more fragmented.
Right. We mentioned those new ideologies earlier, feminism, ecologism.
Exactly. The rise of ideologies like feminism, ecologism, religious fundamentalism, multiculturalism, they opened up completely new ways of thinking about politics. But critically, these ideologies often operate within their own distinct frameworks, their own discourses.
Meaning they focus on different primary battlegrounds than the old market versus state debate?
Yeah. Feminism centers on the discourse of gender, power relations based on sex. Ecologism focuses on humanity's relationship with the natural world, ecological limits. Religious fundamentalism on faith, divine law, and public life. Multiculturalism on culture, identity, diversity.
Okay.
While these might touch on economic or state issues, their core language, their main priorities, are often distinct from that market-state axis that defined the old left-right battle. And this fragmentation makes the traditional left-right divide less universally useful, less able to capture the full picture of political differences today.
So ideology is still very much alive, but it's maybe scattered across different issues now, using different vocabularies, making those old two-sided battle lines feel kind of blurry or incomplete.
That's the argument for why politics might have moved beyond left and right as its main organizing principle. And the source then goes into some specific explanations offered by different thinkers for why this might be happening.
Okay, what are some of those?
Well, one influential idea comes from Samuel Huntington with his Clash of Civilizations thesis. Huntington basically linked the decline of the old left-right ideological struggle to the big shifts in global politics after the Cold War ended. The world wasn't primarily split between two ideological camps anymore, the U.S.-led capitalist West versus the Soviet-led communist East.
So if it wasn't ideology dividing the world, what did Huntington think would?
He argued that future conflicts would increasingly be shaped by identity, and specifically by culture, defining what he called distinct civilizations. In his view, the major challenges or threats to the West wouldn't be ideological anymore, like communism, but civilizational.
Stemming from deep cultural differences.
Yeah, potentially involving regions like the Islamic world or maybe a rising China, seen not primarily as ideological rivals in the old sense, but as distinct cultural entities. It shifts the focus from economic systems to cultural identity as the main fault line.
Interesting. What other explanations are there?
There's a sociological perspective from Anthony Giddens, particularly in his book, which was also titled Beyond Left and Right. Giddens connects the exhaustion of traditional left and right ideologies to the social changes of what he calls high modernity.
High modernity, what does
Uh,
that involve?
Giddens highlights a few key interconnected things. First, globalization, just the increasing reality and awareness that our lives are constantly shaped by events happening miles away. Second, the emergence of a post-traditional social order,
Meaning?
meaning inherited customs and traditions have less of a grip. Individuals have more choices, more freedom, but also maybe less certainty about how to live their lives. And third, he talks about the expansion of social reflexivity.
Social reflexivity. Okay, that sounds complex again. Can you simplify that?
Let's try. Think of it like this. In a really traditional society, your role, your beliefs, your identity were largely set by your family, your village, your inherited customs. You didn't need to constantly question or remake yourself. In high modernity, we're constantly flooded with information, different lifestyles, different ideas, endless choices. Social reflexivity is the idea that we are constantly monitoring ourselves, evaluating our choices, adjusting our lives and beliefs in response to all this incoming information and seeing what others are doing. It's like being hyper-aware of yourself and society simultaneously, making everything feel fluid, provisional, constantly open to revision.
Okay. So in a world where everything feels like it's constantly being reevaluated and remade, those old, relatively fixed ideologies just struggle to keep up. They can't provide solid answers anymore.
That's exactly Giddens' argument. He suggests these super complex, globalized, rapidly changing societies have simply outgrown the old ideological frameworks of left and right. The problems are too fluid, the connections too complex for that old map to be a reliable guide anymore. Politics, he argues, has gone beyond left and right.
And there's another view about complexity, too, from Sill and Katzenstein.
Yeah, their work points in a similar direction. They suggest that in our incredibly interconnected, interdependent world, really understanding complex political problems requires us to go beyond paradigms.
Beyond paradigms, meaning beyond single viewpoints.
Exactly. They argue that no single framework, whether it's an academic discipline like economics or sociology, a specific theoretical system, or indeed an ideological system like liberalism or socialism, is enough on its own anymore to fully explain the really multifaceted realities we face. Political issues today cut across economics, culture, the environment, technology, global relations, identity, you name it.
So relying on just one ideology like the old left or right boxes to explain everything is just insufficient. It misses too much.
Precisely. The world's complexity, they argue, just outstrips the ability of any single paradigm, ideological or otherwise, to capture it all, which again supports this idea that the relatively simple left-right division, born out of the specific problems of modern industrial society, is less able to make sense of the complex, tangled-up issues of our current world.
Okay, so the beyond left and right thesis essentially argues that big societal shifts, postmodern skepticism, globalization, sheer complexity, have eroded the relevance of that old dominant left-right axis. Not because ideology itself is dead, but because it's fragmented, focusing on new issues, new identities, new languages.
That really captures the core of this particular version of endism.
All right, this is fascinating. That brings us to the final form of endism that Haywood discusses, the idea of the triumph of reason or science. This one suggests that, progress in knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, is maybe pushing ideology aside.
Yeah, and this isn't a brand new idea either. It actually has pretty deep historical roots. Haywood traces it back to the 19th century, specifically to Karl Marx and his distinction between ideology and science.
Right. How did Marx see the difference?
Well, for Marx, ideology was inherently false. It was a kind of false consciousness that served the interests of the ruling class under capitalism, the bourgeoisie, by hiding the true nature of exploitation and social relations. It was biased, distorted, designed to mislead the working class.
Okay. But his own ideas.
His own ideas he presented as scientific socialism. He believed his analysis of history, economics, class struggle was objective, based on uncovering scientific laws of societal development. Therefore, it represented truth, not just another biased ideology.
So in that view, science was seen as the opposite of ideology objective, value-free, the path to real knowledge that could liberate humanity from irrational beliefs. And political ideologies were kind of lumped in with superstitions and old prejudices.
Exactly. Science was positioned as the antidote to ideology, the route to objective truth that would eventually make all those subjective, biased, ideological frameworks totally unnecessary. And the source points out that this idea, this kind of myth, really that science will somehow supersede or displace ideology, keeps popping up in modern thought.
Where do we see it more recently?
Well, you see echoes of it, for instance, in discussions around globalization. One aspect often highlighted is the widespread acceptance, globally, of a particular model of rationality, a Western scientific rationality. And alongside that, a huge value placed on technology and technological development as the key drivers of progress.
And the argument is that this massive emphasis on scientific and technical solutions for everything could elbow out those old, messy, value-laden ideological debates.
Precisely. It leads to this idea that scientism might displace ideology. Now, scientism isn't just respecting science. It's more like an exaggerated faith in the power and authority of scientific knowledge and methods, often implying that only things that can be scientifically verified are truly real or provide legitimate reasons for action. The argument is that this growing reliance on scientific and technical rationality to solve the complex problems of a globalized world could marginalize or just push aside more traditional ideologically driven ways of thinking about politics.
But again, the source offers a pretty significant critique here, doesn't it? Suggesting that science might not be the clean opposite of ideology after all.
That's the crucial counter-argument Haywood puts forward. He argues that science, far from being some neutral force that floats above ideology, can actually be seen as operating within ideological frameworks, or even functioning as an ideology itself in certain situations.
How can science be ideological? That sounds counterintuitive to many people.
Well, Haywood points out that science and technology aren't just pursued in a vacuum free of values. They're often deeply intertwined with powerful social forces, particularly industry and technological development. Think about who funds research, what gets researched, how technology gets applied. These decisions are often influenced by specific interests, specific values, not just pure objective curiosity.
So, scientism, that excessive faith in science, could actually be the ideology of a particular powerful group.
That's the suggestion, yeah. Haywood posits that scientism could be interpreted as the ideology of a technocratic elite. Those people who hold significant power and influence because of their technical and scientific expertise. And who benefits most from this massive emphasis on scientism? Maybe large transnational corporations that heavily fund and direct scientific and technological development towards their own ends.
So from that perspective, science isn't just neutral knowledge gathering. It can be a tool, reflecting and reinforcing the values and interests of those who control it.
Exactly. And you only need to look at the clear ideological controversies surrounding science and technology to see that it's not universally viewed as neutral or always beneficial.
What kind of controversies?
Well, the source highlights several. For example, some strands of ecologism don't see science and technology as purely positive forces at all. They argue that the uncritical application of science and technology, often driven by a mechanistic worldview focused on dominating and exploiting nature, is actually the root cause of the environmental crisis we're facing.
Right. And other traditions are wary too.
Definitely. Multiculturalists, and perhaps especially religious fundamentalists, sometimes see the dominance of scientific rationalism as a form of cultural or ideological imperialism. They argue it systematically devalues or even tries to dismantle faith-based ways of knowing, traditional wisdom, alternative perspectives, thereby strengthening Western materialist ways of understanding the world at the expense of other cultural or spiritual views.
So instead of science simply replacing ideology, the actual debate about the role, the limits, the impact of science itself becomes another arena for ideological conflict.
That's the powerful counter-critique. It suggests that the very belief in science as this purely objective, value-free zone, completely separate from the messy world of ideology, might itself be an ideological position, one that serves certain interests and marginalizes other ways of seeing the world.
Wow. Okay. So we've walked through these 4 different ways people have basically announced the death of ideology. Bell's end of ideology from the post-war consensus, Fukuyama's end of history after the Cold War fell, the beyond left and right idea tied to postmodernity and complexity and this triumph of reason or science. But the central argument running through Haywood's analysis, the core insight he pulls out, is that these very claims kind of paradoxically end up demonstrating the enduring power and resilience of ideology itself.
That is absolutely the key takeaway. Haywood identifies this common fundamental flaw in all these versions of endism. In their own ways, every single one declares ideology is over because they believe a specific ideological tradition or maybe a specific way of understanding the world has basically won.
Right. Bell thought welfare capitalism had won. Fukuyama thought liberal democracy had won. The beyond left and right crowd point to postmodern fragmentation or maybe cultural identity winning out over old economic divides. And the triumph of reason, folks point to scientism winning.
Exactly. They're all essentially saying our preferred way of seeing the world, or the way we think is objectively correct, has triumphed, therefore ideology must be dead. But the very act of declaring a winner and saying the debate's over is, in itself, an ideological move. They're conducting the argument from within an ongoing framework of ideological thinking. The debate about the end of ideology is actually part of the continuing story of ideology.
It's like trying to shout silence in a crowded room. The act itself proves the opposite.
That's a great analogy, precisely. So instead of showing ideology's weakness, Haywood argues, this recurring pattern of endism actually highlights its remarkable resilience, its robustness. Once it was invented, ideological politics, this whole process of organizing political thought around competing sets of beliefs, values, visions, has just proven incredibly hard to get rid of. It is, to use his phrase again, stubbornly resistant to being disinvented.
So if it keeps bouncing back, despite all these predictions of its demise, what are the deeper reasons? Why is ideology so sticky, so successful, according to the source?
Haywood offers two main interconnected reasons. The first is really about its adaptability, its flexibility. Ideological traditions aren't these rigid, fixed-in-stone doctrines. They are constantly being redefined, adapted, renewed in response to changing times, changing social conditions, changing historical circumstances.
They evolve, basically. They're not static.
Exactly. They absorb new ideas, they respond to criticisms, they adjust their platforms. And crucially, when old ideologies maybe fail to provide convincing answers anymore or just fade in relevance, new ideologies emerge to tackle new problems, articulate new hopes, new grievances. The whole world of ideologies is dynamic. It changes as society changes.
So it survives partly because it can change its shape, its content.
That's definitely part of it. But the second reason, which Haywood suggests is even deeper, goes right to the fundamental role ideology plays in human society and politics. He argues that ideology is the principal source of meaning and idealism in the political realm. It touches parts of our political lives that other forms of engagement, maybe more pragmatic or technical forms, often miss.
Meaning and idealism. How does ideology provide that? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, it provides a framework, first off, for understanding the world, right? It helps explain complex events. It helps define who we are versus them. It articulates what's wrong with how things are now. But more than just explaining, it gives people a reason to believe in something bigger than just their own immediate personal interests or day-to-day lives.
Okay.
It offers a sense of purpose, a shared identity with others who see the world similarly, and crucially, a vision of a better future. Something worth striving for, maybe even making sacrifices for.
It connects our individual lives to a bigger story, a bigger picture.
Exactly that. Our personal stories, our sense of who we are, our struggles, our hopes for ourselves and our families, they often only really make full sense when we can place them within a broader historical and social narrative. Ideology provides those grand narratives, the stories about where society came from, what the fundamental challenges are now, and where we, collectively, could or should be trying to go. It gives people a sense of direction, a sense of collective agency.
And the source draws a pretty stark conclusion about what a world without that ideological component might actually look like.
Yeah, he suggests quite powerfully that a truly post-ideological age would likely be an age without hope, without vision. If ideology is the main vehicle for carrying idealism, for carrying those forward-looking narratives in politics, then its genuine absence would leave a huge void, a lack of purpose, a lack of direction beyond just the immediate, the technical, the managerial.
And Haywood actually points to certain trends in modern politics, particularly in sort of de-ideologized party politics, as maybe evidence of this kind of void.
Yes, he does. He observes that in many Western democracies, you see mainstream political parties becoming increasingly detached from their historical, strong, clear ideological roots. Instead of being clearly grounded in, say, democratic socialism or classical liberalism or traditional conservatism, they've often drifted towards this kind of pragmatic managerial center.
Focused more on running the existing system than offering a fundamentally different vision of society.
Right. They become less about being a movement with a deep philosophy and more about being the most competent management team.
And what happens when parties lose that deep ideological anchor?
Well, Haywood argues, they struggle to provide that sense of purpose, that shared identity, that emotional connection for their members and potential supporters. Instead of inspiring people with big hopes and dreams for a different future, they often end up feeling like they're just marketing products.
Products
Like presenting a particular leader as the best manager, or offering a bundle of specific, maybe quite technical policies, or often just focusing on criticizing the other party rather than articulating their own positive vision.
And what are the consequences of that, according to Haywood? The shift away from strong ideology in parties.
He links this de-ideologization to things we see quite widely, like falling party membership figures, declining voter turnout in many places, and maybe a general sense of political disaffection or apathy, especially among some groups.
Because if politics feels like it's just about management without any bigger meaning or purpose.
It's harder for people to feel deeply invested, right? If parties don't seem to stand for a distinct vision of the good society, why get deeply involved? Why feel your participation is contributing to something really significant? And he notes that politicians themselves often seem increasingly desperate to try and recapture what they sometimes call the vision thing.
That ability to articulate a compelling purpose that goes beyond just day-to-day policy tinkering.
Exactly. So the difficulties modern political parties often have in generating deep loyalty and enthusiastic participation might actually be a direct symptom of this hollowing out of their ideological roots, really illustrating the vital function that ideology normally performs.
That makes a lot of sense.
So for these fundamental reasons, its inherent flexibility and adaptability, and its crucial role in providing meaning, idealism, narrative, and vision in politics, Haywood ultimately concludes that political ideology isn't going anywhere soon. It's destined, he suggests, to be a continuing, unending process. It will keep changing its forms, its expressions, but it will remain a vital part of human political life because it speaks to this fundamental human need for shared purpose and understanding in our collective existence.
It's a really fascinating conclusion, isn't it? All these predictions of ideology's death, but they actually end up highlighting its incredible ability to adapt and, maybe more importantly, its essential role in giving politics meaning, giving it soul, perhaps.
It completely reframes the conversation, doesn't it? Instead
Right.
of always asking if ideology is dying, maybe the more interesting question is how is it changing? What new forms is it taking right now?
Absolutely. So let's bring this back to you, the listeners, you think about all this. Look at the political arguments and debates happening around you today. Do you see politicians focusing mainly on technical fixes, managing the system like Bell described?
Or do you see conflicts framed more as a clash of civilizations, or primarily about identity and culture, resonating with that beyond left and right idea? Or perhaps you notice lots of debate about the role of science and expertise in solving big societal problems.
And does this analysis from Haywood, the idea that ideology hasn't vanished, but is maybe adapting, fragmenting, morphing, yet still providing that crucial bedrock of meaning, purpose, and vision, does that ring true with your own observations? Does it help make sense of what really seems to drive political passion and engagement in the world you see?
Yeah. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. If, as the source argues quite compellingly, a truly post-ideological age would be an age without hope, without a shared vision for where we're going, what does the continuing presence, the constant evolution, the stubborn resilience of ideology tell us about that fundamental human need? That need for collective stories, shared narratives, and a sense of purpose in our political lives.
It certainly gives you a lot to chew on as you navigate the political landscape out there.
A lot indeed.